candidates, and then Pastor Matt will be teaching us this morning.
Growth takes time. It doesn't happen in a second. It doesn't happen in a day. It takes patience and sometimes a little water in the sun. But it's always happening, even when you can't see it. When it is finally accomplished, it is a beautiful thing.
Well, good morning. It is good to see you here today. If you don't know who I am, I'm Matt Manning, one of the pastors here at Crossroads Church, and it is good to be here with you. You have seen me often here, but I haven't actually been teaching for quite a while. These first few months of 2018, I have not been preaching. Actually, the last time I preached was the last weekend of 2017, and so I'm excited to be able to jump into this. And part of the reason for that, in case you didn't know, is at the end of last year, we moved some pieces around here at Crossroads and moved Brad out of his role here and up to Thornton campus and really over music globally. And he was back last week. Did you guys get a chance to see Brad last week? Yeah. So he was back, last week and being a part of that. Well, I've been really kind of leading this campus here, kind of day to day, and also leading the search for the next campus pastorate at Northglenn here. And so I just want to tell you that's going well. We have 3 really great candidates that we're moving forward with and praying, and you can join us in that prayer. And God willing, in the next couple of months that we will have someone to really begin to take this campus and own this campus and love this campus as the campus pastor. And so if you would, join with me and with Pastor Kim in prayer for that person. Last week, I wasn't here, and the reason I wasn't here last week is because I was in Florida. That we have the opportunity every year to do something that's called senior leadership training through the Global Leadership Summit. It's designed specifically for senior pastors of churches, and every August, we host something that's called the Global Leadership Summit, this 2-day leadership event that's faith-based. It's so great. 500,000 people, 500,000 people are going to attend the summit worldwide this year. And so because of that, we get an opportunity to participate in some of this leadership training for church pastors. And so Pastor Kim and I made that as part of the succession and the transition plan that every year for the last couple of years I've been going there and learning from some great leaders and increasing my leadership capacity as I step into bigger and greater roles of senior leadership here at Crossroads Church. And so I just want you to know the weather in Florida was beautiful, and I brought it back with me, all right? So you're welcome, okay? All right, so as we jump in today, as Pastor Kim said, we're starting a brand new series called Bloom, where we're looking at what does it look like to be a disciple of Jesus? What does it mean to really organize and order my whole life around the work of Jesus in my life. And so as we begin there, I'm really excited for this series, not just to say I'm excited, but because this is my passion. This is what gets me up in the morning. This is what gets me excited. This is what gets me moving. That I've spent my entire life really pursuing discipleship with Jesus. What does that look like in my own life? And I've given my life to helping others like you to figure that out. What does this discipleship journey look like in your life? And so as we begin this together, I want to begin with a question, and it's point number 1 in your outline, and it's this question. What do you want? What do you want, or what do I want? I want you to take a moment. I want you to think about that question. What is it that you want in this life? And I want you just to jot down a few things, the first things that come to your mind when you're asked the question, what do I want? What do I want? For some of you, maybe you look at that and it's some peace. Maybe you want peace in your life. Maybe you have some broken relationships. Maybe some of you want a brand new car, that Maserati that's just sitting there calling your name. Maybe it's a new house. Whatever it is, what is it that you want? Write that down. You got it? All right, good. Well, last summer, I was out with my buddy Dave Powers, talking life over some spring rolls. Now, what you need to know about Dave Powers is one of the most God-honoring, fun-loving guys that I know. He's like a build you up kind of guy, a fill you up kind of guy. And when you're done with Dave Powers, life is just more colorful, like God's presence is just like all around you. You know, the kind of people that I'm talking about, like we have two types of people, you know, kind of in our life. We have the people that like drain and suck life out of us, and after you talk to them, you're like, where's the Drano? And then you have the people that just like totally fill into your life, and when you're done with them, you're like, man, can we just hang out more? Like that's Dave Powers in my life, all right? And so Dave and I are hanging out, and when I'm hanging out with Dave, the thought that comes to my mind is forget being like Mike, I want to be like Dave, all right? Dave is just this great guy. And so I looked at Dave, and as we're eating these spring rolls, I looked at him and I said, Dave, what was the most impactful thing that you've done this last year in terms of your spiritual journey? And Dave kind of leaned in and he said, Matt, you know what I did is I went through and I read the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He goes, I read those 4 Gospels very intentionally looking for every question that Jesus asked. And he goes, what I would do is I would just go through and I would highlight a question that Jesus asked, and then I would just ponder on it. And he goes, it was so amazing. It was so powerful. He goes, it was so like when Jesus asked a good question, a great question, it was like the whole world opened up. And he goes, man, I'm just like learning to ask good questions. And then he leaned over and he pointed his finger at me and he goes, you know what, Matt? You ask really good questions. And immediately what went through my mind is, oh my, Dave thinks I'm Jesus. Like everybody needs a friend like this, right? I mean, he's just a fill you up kind of guy. And so I went home, woke up the next morning, doing my time with Jesus, and I decided, you know what? Like, I want to do what Dave did. I'm going to read through the Gospels, and I'm going to look for the questions that Jesus asked. And so I opened up the Gospel of John, and I started reading, and I didn't have to read very far, that in chapter 1, around verse 38, Jesus asked his first question. And the question that he asked is this: what do you want? What do you want? Now, these 2 guys are following Jesus around. They're like literally stalking Jesus. They would become followers of Jesus, but before they get there, they're following Jesus around, they're stalking him, and Jesus wheels around on them, and he pointedly asks this question to them: what is it that you want? What are you seeking? What do you want? Now, that's the question, isn't it? It's the first, last, and most fundamental question of discipleship. It's the question that's buried under almost every other question that Jesus asked. That when Jesus arrives on the scene, he never asks, what do you believe? He never asks, what do you know? But what he asks is, what do you want? That what do you want is the most piercing question that Jesus could ever ask, because it gets to our wants, our longings, our desires. And those wants, longings, and desires are the core of who we are and our identity. And it's the wellspring in which all of our behaviors and all of our actions flow from. And my goal today, and really over the next 5 weeks as we move through this Bloom series, is to help answer this question, is to discover what our answer is to this question. That I want us to explore, what is it that we really want? And as we go through this sermon series, one of the things that I've been praying for in preparation for this over the last several months is that God would reawaken our faith. And as the spring flowers come into bloom as we head into Easter, so too would our faith bloom again. And that we would come to realize that discipleship is more of a perspective of hungering and thirsting, that the command of Jesus to follow him is a command to align our longings and our loves with his. Our desires with his desires. Our wants with his wants. And the way that we're going to unpack that specifically today is by looking at a couple of stories in John chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles, I want you to go ahead and turn to John chapter 6. If you don't have a Bible, we would love to give you one. We really do consider it an honor to be able to give you a Bible. And so if you don't have one, we'd love for you to leave here with one today. You can just stop by our information center, pick one up, and take it with you. Now, while you turn to John chapter 6, I'll kind of bring you up to speed on what's going on here. That at the beginning of this chapter, Jesus is teaching to 5,000 men. That 5,000 men have come out to hear what Jesus has to say, along with women and children. Now, most scholars would put the attendance sitting on this hillside listening to Jesus at somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people. That 10 or 15,000 people have gathered. This enormous crowd has gathered to hear Jesus preach. But not only that, they've gathered also to see him do something miraculous. See, word has gotten out that Jesus is this miracle worker, and that people who hang with Jesus all of a sudden find themselves healed, that blind men see and lame men walk, and people who were dead are now alive, that this guy does amazing things. And so people are gathered together not only to hear him teach, but to see something miraculous happening. And so Jesus speaks throughout the whole morning to this enormous crowd, and then lunchtime begins to happen. And people begin to get restless. They're hungry. And so Jesus tells them all to sit down on the grass. He finds this little boy. He takes his Captain America lunchbox. He pulls out 5 loaves of bread, all right, 5 loaves of rye. This is the food of the poor, 2 small fish. And he does something miraculous with that, where he multiplies that continuously until thousands upon thousands are fed. Now, whether you grew up in church world or not, you hear that story and you go, heard that one before. And when we do that, oftentimes we miss out on how spectacular this actually is, how big this miracle is, because food in the first century was huge. That when I first got to Crossroads, I worked with the college ministry here, and I can tell you free food works, right? I mean, you want a big crowd, you want more college students than you know what to do with, just offer free food, right? I mean, free food works today. You can only imagine how it worked back then. There's no refrigeration. People were always looking for food, that this is really quite an amazing miracle. Now, after everybody gets fed and everybody eats, what happens next is this entire crowd of people, 10,000 people, decide, we want to vote this guy king. Because if you had a vote for king, and one king's like, hey, I'll lower taxes and build better roads, and the other king's like, I'll heal you and feed you, which one are you voting for? Yeah, you're going to vote for the guy who heals you and feeds you, right? Every time. So too with them. And so they're like, man, we want that guy. And so they come up with this plan that they're forcibly going to take the throne and put Jesus on it. And Jesus is like, I don't want anything to do with that. And so he sends his disciples across the lake, across the Sea of Galilee. He goes off and wanders off by himself. Eventually the disciples and Jesus, they come back together in like one of the most like amazing mic drop entrances of all time. You can read about it in John chapter 6. Eventually they end up in a city called Capernaum, all right? The next day, the crowd gathers together on this hillside where they had seen Jesus the day before, and they realize that Jesus is not there, and that's where we pick up the story in chapter 6, verse 24. So when the crowd saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum, seeking Jesus. They're like, we're sticking with the free food guy, all right? Verse 25. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? That's their question. When did you come here? And really, this is just a polite way of beginning a conversation. But Jesus knows where all this is going. He knows why they're there. He sees their motives. He knows their heart. They're there because they want Jesus to do stuff for them. Verse 26, and Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him God the Father has set his seal. Now here's what's going on. That Jesus looks out at this crowd and he says, here's what you're here for. Ultimately, you're here to get more free food. You're here to get another lunch. You're here to get stuff. That's why you're here. And the crowd begins to pick up on that Jesus isn't much interested in a second act. That he's not interested in doing another miracle. So they start taunting him. And they start playing the, well, if you're really God card, you know? And then they start, like toddlers, start playing the comparison game. And they start comparing him to Moses. See, because even though they had just witnessed, they had just experienced this amazing miracle, where 10,000 people were fed. This was another day. And no longer were their stomachs full. And they remembered back to Moses, that Moses gave God's manna every day. And that the people who hung out, the Israelites who hung with Moses day in and day out, they didn't get fed on one random day, one time. They got fed every day for like 40 years. And so Jesus is there. And the crowd begins to taunt him, and they say to him, if you want us to see and believe who you are, you need to keep working, brother. You need to show us some more signs. You need some more miracles. You keep doing that stuff, and maybe we'll believe in Jesus. And Jesus looks at them, right? And realizes that all the while they're missing the point. That the food was just an object lesson. That they saw miraculous signs, but to them it was nothing more than an easy meal. That they failed to see the bigger picture that Jesus was painting, verse 32. And Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses," let's get this straight, "it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven." In other words, you guys are so focused on the bread, but that's not even the main point. That's not even the main point of the miracle here. The bread is pointing to something bigger, something larger, something richer. And Moses isn't even the main player in the game. God is. God's giving the bread. God's giving it to you. Now don't miss the you here, because God's giving you the bread. God gives it. God's given you the bread of life. That's it. He offers it to you. It's free. Take it, eat it. Verse 33. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And they said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus, where do we find the bread that you speak of? And in that moment, Jesus pulls back the curtain and he levels with them that this bread talk over the last 24 hours was all about him. When he says to them in verse 35, that I am the bread of life, that whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall not thirst. Now, it's hard for me to exaggerate how important this verse has come to mean to me. That this verse has become my life's verse. It's something that I think about every day when I wake up. That this verse has put in perspective for me what my relationship with Jesus is and what it means to be a disciple of his. That Jesus said that I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. Now notice the parallel in verse 35. Coming, never hunger. Believing, never thirst. That Jesus' intention with these two phrases is that they would interpret them themselves for us. That you would use these phrases to interpret each other. That this coming is a geographical term. It's a metaphor. That my soul comes. It comes. There's a table. There is bread. I'm coming. I'm eating. Why? So that I'm satisfied. And what Jesus is doing is he's making the connection for us that our coming and believing, this satisfaction that we get from the bread and the water, that this is all pointing to him, point number 2. That the bread and the water are both images of Jesus, which means that believing in Jesus is a soul coming to Jesus to be satisfied in all that he is. That believing in Jesus, that our saving faith, is a soul coming to Jesus to be satisfied in all that he is. That's not a decision, simply a decision. That's a gift. When we sit down at a banquet, when we eat some good food together, it's not like we choose to be satisfied, right? We just simply are. That when you enjoy a great meal, you are satisfied. Now get this, because here's what Jesus is saying. That Jesus is saying, and this is huge, that he ultimately is the object of our desire. That this is the huge reality that speaks to my life. That Jesus has been merciful to me by revealing himself as the true treasure of my life. That Jesus says, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. What that does not mean is that we won't hunger and thirst. What it does mean is that when we hunger and thirst, we know exactly where to go. We know exactly what to do with it. We know exactly where to turn. That in a very real sense, what Jesus is inviting us to is that we eat up the glories of Jesus. That there is a never-ending supply there. That this is what we're made for. All other things, our treasures, our pleasures, our desires, our glories, point to this one grand reality that Jesus is the all-satisfying end of every longing and desire that we've ever had. Now, I know that some of you are sitting there and you're like, Matt, this is like Bible 101. Why is this such a big deal? Why is this so huge? Why are you belaboring this point? Well, let me tell you why. That if this reality, if this truth ever got from your brain to your heart, if it ever got from here to here, it would change your entire life. It would change everything. See, if this reality, this truth ever got from here to here, you would never read your Bibles the same way again. You wouldn't. If this reality ever came from here to here, you would never see your obedience and faith the same again. If this reality ever got from here to here, you would never again think about your fight for holiness in the same way. If this truth ever made it from here to here, it would absolutely change the way that you viewed your entire life. Because when you begin to see that your whole life is being satisfied with all that God is for you in Jesus, then the fight for your life becomes a fight for joy. And that you would do whatever it takes, whatever you must do to see Jesus for who he is and savor Jesus above all things. And so as we began this sermon, so we end it. What is it that you want? What is it that you want? Last summer, when I read that question, it rocked my world. Totally unexpectedly, it rocked my world. And I had to come and take an honest look at my own life. And the reason that it rocked my world is because what I knew in my mind is that my doing was way outpacing my being. That my doing for Jesus was way outpacing my being for Jesus. And what God hit me with was this, that he had gifted me in such a way that it would be possible for me to build a church on my own talents and experiences. That I could serve Jesus out of my own energy and wisdom. And I could expand ministry and I could preach boldly without ever thinking much or relying upon Jesus in the process. And if my efforts prove successful, not a single person sitting here would ever question the gap between what I did and who I was. And that thought rocked my world. And I decided that I needed God to revive my longings. And I picked up a book by Pete Scazzaro called The Emotionally Healthy Leader. And as I read that first chapter of that book, it scared the bejeebies out of me. like it did. Because as I read Pete's story, there was markers along the way that reminded me a little too much of my own story. And it took me a while to process what God was rocking in my soul. And it took me a little longer to share with my wife, Sarah, and a bit longer even then to share with one of my good friends, Mark Perry. And I shared with both of them what God was doing in my life. And then I asked them if they would both go on this journey with me. And if we would walk this road together. And as I've shared this level of transparency with people that I've come in contact with since, I've come to find out that a lot of people live in this space where their doing for Jesus way outpaces their being for Jesus. In their careers, in their ministries, with their businesses, in their marriages, with their children, their families. And what I've come to realize is this. If we don't learn to slow down and deeply connect with Jesus, then all we're doing is rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. And what we need to be able to do as a people of God is to be able to rest and to be satisfied with all that God is for me in Jesus. To allow God every access of my life. From the crucial decisions that I make in ministry and in business, with my career, all the way to conversations that I have with my wife and my kids, all the way to managing the emotional triggers that happen in my life. See, when Jesus swung around and he asked those two would-be followers the question, what do you want? What that was an invitation into a miraculous journey that would forever change their life through a relationship with him. And so in the final moments that we have together before we go to communion, what I want to do is I want to teach you an old spiritual practice called the daily examine. The daily examine. All right? that this has been a tool that I've used over the course of the last couple of months, that God has used in my life to begin to revive some longings that have been missing. Now, for you spelling Nazis, as we go through this, examine is spelled right, okay? So it's not the examine the way you think of examine. It's examine in a different way, all right? So it's called the daily examine. So here's what I've been doing. I've been disciplining myself twice a day to simply to slow down and to be connected to Jesus deeply. And the way that I've been doing that is through this daily examine. And the daily examine begins with this. It begins with silence and solitude for 2 minutes. Silence and solitude for 2 minutes. Now, for some of you, this will be very easy. For others of you, it'll be hard. For me, it's like so difficult, right? You put me in the mountains by myself, 42 seconds later, I'm talking to a tree, all right? Silence is not a big space. I don't have a lot of space in my life for silence. But I'm learning, and it's becoming easier. And I've been really working hard at disciplining myself to simply be in the silence and to be in the solitude with Jesus. And as I sit there quietly, of course, my mind wanders to all these different things. And as my mind wanders, I just quote Psalm 46. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. For 2 minutes, I just sit in silence and solitude. And I allow God to speak to my soul. And after those 2 minutes, I move into a place where I look for the blessings of God's life, or the blessings that God's given me in my life, and to be grateful for them. That I'm grateful for the blessings that God has given me. Sometimes it's just the very basic sense that the air that we breathe, what a blessing that is, that every day I wake up and I don't even have to worry about breathing. That I look at my wife and my kids and thank God for the gifts that they've given me, for this church, for the mountains and the sunrise and the beautiful sunsets. That I spend time just looking at the blessings of my life and practicing gratitude out of that. And then after that, I move on to the third part, where I review those times where God's presence has been in my life and those times where I've specifically ignored them. Like I sit down and I take account over the last couple of hours, where has God been present in my life? And where are those times that I have willfully ignored his presence to do something that I wanted to do? After that, I review my emotions. That's the fourth part. I review my emotions. I mentioned at the beginning that last week I was in Florida for training. And my mom came out to watch our kids while we were there. She lives in Kentucky, and so she flew out to watch our kids. And Sarah and I decided, well, why don't we go out a couple of days early just for some like R&R, for just some rest and relaxation. And so we went out there 2.5 days early. And the whole goal was just we're going to connect with God and we're going to connect with each other. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to enjoy God's creation, right? I mean, we were at Clearwater Beach, the #1 beach in America. And we're going to read and we're going to talk about them things and we're going to journal. And for 2 days, that's the agenda. There's no agenda. Just the agenda is rest, all right? Well, I woke up kind of mid-morning of day 2. I had this anxious feeling on my chest all morning. I just had this anxiousness about me. And I went through this for a couple hours of just carrying this anxiousness around on the second day we were there. And I sat down and I was like, man, I got to figure out what this is. And so I sat down and I started to work through the daily examine. And I got to the emotions and then I started to just ask the questions, why do I feel this anxiousness? And what I came to realize is that my anxiousness was there is because that day I woke up late. Like I slept in. Now, I never sleep in, all right? But on that day, I slept in. And then I didn't have anything to do on my to-do list. Like my to-do list was like 0, right? It was nothing. It was connect with God and connect with my spouse. That was my to-do list. And here I was anxious because I didn't have anything to do, right? I mean, welcome to my dysfunction, all right? I'm in the #1 beach, beautiful place in the U.S., and there I am freaking out because the whole agenda is to rest, and I can't rest because I don't have enough to do, right? And so I identified that. And I worked through that, and I just prayed a short prayer. God, just would you help me rest in you? Would you help me be okay with just simply resting and not doing, with being with you? The fifth part then is to express sorrow for sin and ask for forgiveness, where I just confess the sins over the last few hours that I've had and just fall on his mercy seat asking for his forgiveness. Then the next part is that I pray for the grace. I pray for the grace to be more available to the God who loves me. That I would say, God, in these moments over these next few hours, just help me be more present with you. Help me see what you see. Help me feel you. Help me know you. And then that time ends with 2 more minutes of silence and solitude. Twice a day. This is what I've been doing for the last couple of months. And here's what I found. When I slow down and work at connecting deeply with Jesus, here's what I get. That I have this overwhelming sense of peace in my life. Overwhelming sense of peace. The frustrations, the anxieties, the anger, it all dissipates. I find myself not wondering if God is there, because I take accounts of this is where God's been present in my life, that I actually see his activity in my life. I'm reminded every time that I go through this that God loves me, not because of what I've done, but in spite of everything that I've ever done. God's love is there for me. But most of all, what I'm finding is that what I want is more of Jesus. That going to that well time and time again out of joy, experiencing that deep satisfaction of knowing that I am his and he is mine. And out of that, there is a well inside of me that is bursting with desire for him. And so as we go to moments of communion, I'm going to invite you for a few moments to just work through this daily examine in your own life. That we'll create the space for a few moments just for you to work through this, to slow down and to connect deeply with Jesus. And the way that we're going to begin is I'm going to ask you all to bow your head, and we're just going to sit in silence for 2 minutes. And then I'll pray, and they'll lead us in a song, and we'll pass the elements, all right? Will you join with me? Bow your head with me. Be still and know that I am God. God, it is good to just sit in your presence. to allow you to speak to our souls, to allow you access into our lives, and to know that even just sitting in the silence, just being in your presence is good. Lord, I give you thanks for the way that you speak to us. As we remember today going to your communion table, the great gift of your Son, stepping out of heaven and into this world. God, sometimes I sit back and I just in wonder and awe of what were you thinking that you gave up everything to die on a cross so that I might have life. God, thank you for that gift. Thank you for the tremendous blessing of this church. Lord, a family who's so far from perfect, but God, who love each other and care for each other, coming together week in and week out to pursue you, to corporately worship together, to be met here in your presence and with others. God, thank you. God, thank you for who you are. God, we look out at the creation and are amazed, and you've created it all. We look at our own lives and see the mercy and grace that you've poured out on us, Lord, that we did not deserve, and we give you thanks. We know that you are good, and we declare it today, and we give thanks. And so, Lord, as we move into this time of communion and have a few moments, Lord, I pray that you would speak to our souls as we work through this. And that these few moments, Lord, of pausing today before you would satisfy our soul. It's in Jesus' name I pray.
Change my heart.